Welcome to the PanAm Post coverage of the Conservatives International launch meeting in Miami, Florida. Today we have a very special guest, Thierry Baudet, leader of the Forum for Democracy Party in the Netherlands, academic, widely published writer, and of course politician. Thierry, thank you very much for being with us. Well, I wanted to ask you, first of all, could you explain to our American viewers especially, how was your journey? You recently made it into the Dutch Parliament with, I think, 2 seats for a new party. This is quite important. Why did you decide to move from academia and from journalism into politics at this point?
Because I felt that something really had to change, and we needed more than just academic publications and debates. We needed a change from the political level as well. What we see in Europe in general and in the Netherlands in particular is uncontrolled immigration problems and a political elite that is unwilling to do something about it. At the same time, we see an ever-expanding European Union that takes away from the national states more and more sovereign power. So we see a gradual delusion of national sovereignty, national identities through mass immigration and sovereignty through the EU. And I think that's a very dangerous development and we have to change it.
Right, when you talk about especially immigration, also the EU, your Euroscepticism, maybe someone from abroad would say, well, your speech sounds somewhat similar to that of Geert Wilders, the Freedom Party. So the question would be, why did you create your own party, or how are you different from that movement?
Because I think in Mr. Wilders' rhetoric, he goes too far and in that way loses the ability to convince the people to move in a different direction. So he's an opposition party, but so extreme in banning the Quran, banning all mosques from the country. I mean, these policy proposals are not feasible and not realistic. So there is a stalemate situation in the Netherlands where on the one hand we have the mainstream political parties that want to continue the project of gradual delusion of the nation state, and on the other hand we have the populist response to it, Mr. Wilders' party, which is not a realistic alternative. So there's a vacuum there. There's a huge niche of a serious, let's say, nationalist, but moderately, liberally nationalist party, which is the one I founded, the Forum for Democracy. And I think we're doing really well in the polls now. We won in the elections 2 months ago. We're going to do much better in the upcoming elections. So something is really happening in the Netherlands, I think.
Okay, when you mentioned this Euroscepticism, perhaps our viewers don't know this, but Holland, even though your country was a founding member of the EU, in 2005 in a referendum, voters rejected what was then the European Constitution, which was then passed through as the Lisbon Treaty. But could you talk or tell us why there is this Euroscepticism in Holland, which is perhaps more associated with Brexit, but also has deep roots in
Oh yeah,
the
absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that people misunderstand about the Netherlands is that because our political elites have been very pro-EU and pro-internationalist and supranationalist actually, the Dutch population has not been. And over the several decades that we've had opinion polls, a majority of the Dutch have been very skeptical of increased powers of the European Union. We indeed had a referendum in 2005 where almost 2/3 of the Dutch population rejected the proposed EU constitution. We had another referendum about EU expansion last year in April 2016, and again almost
that was the expansion into the Ukraine.
Exactly.
And you were one of the leaders against the EU expansion in the Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And why was that?
Well, we had a general debate about do we need a European Union that, with so many things not in order in its present form, continues to expand and enlarge its scope and take on more responsibilities and take on a role in an international geostrategic conflict that's going on in the Ukraine, which is very, very complicated. Do we really need our EU to do that, or can we as national states deal with these issues much better? Well, that was certainly the view that the Dutch voters took. And so we had, again, an almost 2/3 majority no vote on this. So we see a very Eurosceptic population in the Netherlands, and I think the apex of that was reached 2.5 months ago when an opinion poll showed that 56% of the Dutch preferred a future for their country outside of the EU. I mean, these figures are higher than the Brexit vote.
Right. And your goal, if for instance you would form part of a coalition government or eventually perhaps lead a government, would your goal be to take the Netherlands completely out of the EU?
Yes.
You're not one of these people saying, oh, the EU can be reformed some way. It's completely hopeless.
Yes. Okay. Yes, and I say this with some regret, because I think the idea of European cooperation is perfect and very, very well, and we are a very international-minded party, and the Netherlands has been a very open and international economy for many centuries, but the European Union is a racket. It's not working. The euro currency is destroying the economies in the south, and it's also very bad for the economies and the pension savings in the north. The open borders do not work. The system of regulation that strangles our economies is not working. It's not flexible enough for all the different economies of the European Union. So we need a different framework. We need to think in terms of free trade agreements and proper international cooperation of the kind that we're having this weekend here in Florida. We should talk together. We should be good friends and good neighbors, but not part of a continental superstructure.
Right, in the recent election, the international press presented it as a defeat for populism, especially in terms of Geert Wilders. I think Die Welt in Berlin had a headline, something like it was not only a victory for him, for the Prime Minister Mark Rutte, but for all of Europe, for the European Union, basically. Do you see it that way, or what? Because I noticed that even the Prime Minister had to change his speech a bit during the campaign, or quite a lot, and he actually started criticizing immigration, started taking more of a line, maybe along your line of
yes,
thought.
Definitely.
So how do you view that election? Was it really a triumph for the EU, or did
No.
Euroscepticism really make its mark?
Well, I mean, general elections are inherently in the name about general subject, lots of different subjects, and people vote for different reasons. So we shouldn't confuse elections with referenda, where you can actually say, the people voted for this or for that. But despite that general observation, the parties that have now more than 55% of parliamentary seats have all campaigned significantly on an anti-immigration platform. This is the case for the classical Liberal Party of Mark Rutte, our current Prime Minister. It's also the case for the Christian Democrats. Our party is very skeptical about mass immigration, and so it's not true that the open-minded, open borders kind of people won the elections. That said, the classical Liberal Party of our Prime Minister has also campaigned on a Eurosceptic ticket. But of course, the reality is, once they're re-elected, once they're in power again, they start making pro-EU decisions all the time. So we see a deceit of the people, where they're being promised more national sovereignty, more control over their immigration and so on, less EU. But what happens is the opposite. So I think we're in a process now in the Netherlands, and I think this is the case for many other European countries, where people are beginning to realize, look, our political leaders are promising one thing and then doing another thing. We shouldn't vote for them anymore, and that's why I think new political parties have a great future.
Right, since immigration is so prominent in this debate, what would be your ideal situation? Simply to stop all immigration?
Oh, absolutely not. We propose what we call the Australian model, where we decide as a country who to admit and who not to admit. So we should stop allowing people from all over the world just to come to the Netherlands and demand a permanent residence or just a residence in general. And we should say, look, who can we offer a place here? What kind of people do we need in our economy? Who do we think actually need it now? And then we should have a vote on it in Parliament every year and say, look, this is our immigration target for this year. And then next year we're going to decide on it again. That's the way to take control. That's the way to do it.
Right. How much of the problem do you think is created by a welfare state, or the incentives that are generous?
Well, they're perverse, of course.
Give to people who might not really want to go to Holland to work, but rather to take advantage of the situation.
Yes, well, these observations are absolutely accurate. Open borders and a welfare state are a disastrous combination.
It's the Milton Friedman.
Exactly, yeah, of course. And it's a widely known fact. It's an observation that anyone can do every day in Europe today. But we have a problem with our political leadership. They're not willing to do something about it. My party, 2 weeks ago, proposed in Parliament 5 very concrete measures to deal with this issue. For example, one of the stunning things, once an asylum seeker has been rejected by the Netherlands, we do not detain him and deport him back to his country of origin. Instead, he is told to leave and then can do whatever he or she likes. This is not the way seriously to deal with these issues when you have a massive immigration problem. But almost all political parties rejected our proposals in this. So we can clearly see that the political leaders, they speak immigration skeptic language, but in the end they're not willing to do something about it. And I think what the real explanation behind that is that they are unwilling to frustrate the EU project of open borders, of intermingling European nations. And the reason they're not willing to do that is because they have ambitions in the EU. They are national political leaders, but really aiming for the next step. And that's one of the problems we have in the Netherlands, but I think it's the case in almost all European countries. Our political leaders are not representatives of the people in our capitals. They are the representatives of Brussels in our capitals.
Well, once they work in the EU, they don't have to worry about elections, for example.
Exactly. I'll tell you even more. You usually have to have lost a national election.
Right, right. Well, and just to conclude, even though with Brexit and these kind of events, it's difficult to make predictions, but how do you see, or what do you see in the EU happening in, for instance, 10 years, 15 years?
I've always said we have basically two scenarios. The first is what I call the Czechoslovakia scenario, and the second is the Yugoslavia scenario. I think the European Union it's an experiment against reality. It's something that cannot continue to exist because the differences between the member states are too great. The economic differences, the political differences, the moral and ethical intuitions of all the different countries. I mean, they're fine in their own ways, but to put them all in the same room doesn't work. But it remains to be seen if this inevitable breakup of the EU is going to be peaceful and orderly and friendly and decent and properly arranged, like the breakup of Czechoslovakia in the early 1990s, or if we're going to get a very bloody and very painful and very difficult, perhaps even violent breakup that will remind us more of Yugoslavia. I mean, those are the options in my view, and we need political leaders that choose for the Czechoslovakia option.
Well, thank you very much, Thierry Baudet, up and coming star in the Dutch Parliament.